When I was 13 years old, my dad was getting married to my stepmom. Her side of the family owned a fishing cabin in the mountains in very northern Washington state. It was her grandfather's and it stayed in the family. This cabin was in the middle of nowhere. I'm not kidding. The nearest town was tiny, like population less than 100. You have to drive up into mountains on dirt roads for about 45 minutes to an hour to get to the cabin. It sat just above a small lake, very beautiful and secluded. No other cabins around. Nothing. Just the one. I had never been to a place like it before, or since. So I'm 13. My soon-to-be stepbrother is 10. My soon-to-be stepsister is 5. And my stepmom was pregnant with my half-sister. My dad and stepmom decided they wanted to have a very small wedding at the cabin, so we drove up to it the day before the ceremony. Everybody else who was attending would be arriving the next day, the day of the wedding, except for my stepmom's youngest brother and his girlfriend. We'll call them James and Vicky. They were also arriving the same day as us, as we had planned to light fireworks and celebrate the night before. So another thing about this cabin, there's no television, no radio, no phones, only electricity and water. This also took place in the late 90s, when most people had pagers if anything, definitely not cell phones. So we're at the cabin and decide to take a small rowboat out to fish for our dinner. It's dusk at this time. I remember I kept looking back up at the cabin to see if James and Vicky had arrived, because they were in their late 20s and young and fun, and all of us kids were really excited for them to get there. So my family and I are sitting in the boat, and I turn my head to look at the cabin again. This time, I see a woman standing on the patio facing us. She's wearing a long white gown. It looks to be made of lace. It goes up over her neck like an old-fashioned dress looks. Her hair is up. She's waving at us. The only thing I can't make out are the features of her face. There's a man standing next to her, but he's turning to walk around the side of the cabin. He had a cowboy hat on and a Sherpa-lined leather coat. I got so excited I said, "Look, James and Vicky are here." My whole family looked up at the cabin and exclaimed, "They're here." My dad rowed us in fast. We ran up the short hill to the patio where they had just been standing. Nobody was there, no car in the drive next to ours, no note, no sign that anybody had been there. It was really weird. We all felt strange. My parents distracted us somehow, and soon we forgot because of the excitement of the wedding. The next day, guests are arriving, including James and Vicky. They said sorry we couldn't make it last night. We broke down on the way and didn't have the ability to call you because there are no phones here. It was no big deal. We were just glad they made it. Fast forward 6 months after the wedding. It's Christmas dinner and James is over. Suddenly, the experience dawns on me for the first time since it happened. All I said was, "Hey Mum," I call my stepmom Mum. "Remember that time we were at the cabin and we thought we saw James and Vicky, but it wasn't them?" James immediately interrupts me and says very seriously, "One time Vicky and I were at the cabin fishing. It was around sunset, and I looked up at the patio to see a woman standing in a white dress waving at us." Everybody at the table got very quiet. Then he mentioned the man in the cowboy hat and seeing him walk around the cabin a time or two. He and my mum got emotional and deduced that the man and woman must be their grandpa and his first wife. I haven't been to that cabin since then, though I wish I had. I get goosebumps every time I tell that story. I can still see them in my mind, clear as day. There are so many stories about my grandfather's house, the house my father grew up in since he was 9 years old. Every person who has ever stayed in that house has at least one experience. To begin, let me explain that my grandfather had the house built in Northridge, California in 1969. The land was previously orange groves, so it never made sense to my family how the house ended up haunted, unless there were unknown burials in the land. The main stories I would hear growing up from my dad and uncle were things like being tugged awake in the night on the shoulder or ankle, but nobody is there. Also, the upstairs was open, so you could see the hallway and the doorways while sitting downstairs in the living room. There was a railing along the hallway upstairs, which is why you could see, and the television was backed up against the bottom of the staircase. So sitting on the couch watching TV, you could see most of the upstairs in your peripherals. It was very common to see somebody very quickly walk out of one room and into another one. Even the family dog would react to these happenings. Everybody who lived in the house accepted that it was haunted, except for my grandfather. Apparently, he called it all nonsense. After all, he was a man of science and logic, which is why it's funny that he's the only person in the family to have seen the full body apparition. It was a rumor in our family for many years, but my uncle had overheard him telling his wife, our grandma, that he came home late from work to find an old man with long grey hair standing inside the entryway. None of us ever had the guts to ask him, because he always shut down things like that. Well, the last time I saw him, I felt like asking, so I did. I said, "Hey Grandpa, there's a rumor in the family that one night you came home from work and saw a man in the house." He straightened up and his eyes widened. Very indignantly, he said, "I did. I got home around midnight and I unlocked the door, and standing right inside was an old man with long grey hair staring at me. I had no choice but to assume my eyes were playing tricks on me, so I went back outside and waited for a minute and came back in." To me, that absolutely proves that he knew it was a ghost. There is no way he would walk into his house in the middle of the night and see a man in there, knowing his family are asleep and vulnerable, and then step back outside and close the door to see if it goes away. This is my cousin's story, who I'm close with, who actually spent more time at my grandpa's house than I did. My cousin, I'll call him Jeff, is about 5 years older than me. I was living up north in Washington at the time, and he lived down here in Los Angeles near our grandpa. He was probably about 19 or 20 when this happened. So my grandpa and his wife decided they wanted to sell the house and move to Puget Sound. I was really bummed about it. We had a lot of great memories in that house. Even though it was haunted, it had a great vibe, except for when the hauntings were happening. So my grandpa and his wife were up north in Washington, handling the final paperwork to purchase their house, and they asked my cousin Jeff to stay down here and house sit the haunted house for them. He totally agreed. He was 20 years old, and it was a great chance for him to have a whole house to himself and get away from his mum and sisters. So he says, like, the first week and a half, everything's fine. Then one night, he's sitting in the room that the family refers to as the ghost room, because it's where most of the freakiest stuff happens. The ghost room was also the computer room. When you're sitting at the computer, your back is facing the doorway that opens into the upstairs hall. He said that he had been listening to KROQ earlier, but at this point, he had the radio off. It was pretty late at night and quiet. Suddenly, he heard a voice behind him from the hall that he said sounded neither male or female, and it said in a very weird and quirky inflection, KROQ. He froze in fear. Like, we've all grown up hearing all the freaky-ass stuff about this house and experiencing some ourselves, so he is immediately crapping it. He said it sounded like the house came alive, like he could hear the cupboards closing and people moving things around downstairs in the kitchen and family area, even though he was completely alone. He said it went on for hours, So he went to the room next to the computer room and curled up on the bed in the corner with the door open a crack so he could see out into the hallway. He said he started to nod off after a while. Then something made him jerk awake just in time to catch a ponytail of grey hair and an elbow with a green shirt on walking past the bedroom in the hallway. He basically called my dad crying because he knew my dad would understand what he was going through and wouldn't think he was crazy. But instead of my dad calming him down, he just started telling him all his stories that happened to him, which just led to my cousin becoming absolutely, inconsolably terrified. He called my grandpa and told him he didn't want to watch the house anymore. My grandpa was pissed, called my dad and yelled at him for telling Jeff all the scary stuff. My dad was like, dude, I wanted him to know that I lived through it and I'm fine, and other people have experienced it and it's been okay. He's a 20-year-old man, for Christ's sake. Always loved that particular story, especially when I get to see the look on my cousin's face when he retells it. I live only 5 miles from the house, and I drive by sometimes for nostalgic purposes. I have a lot of beautiful childhood memories of that home, and I know for a fact there is no way the current owners aren't experiencing all the crazy that house has to offer. Sometimes I wonder if I should knock on the door and ask them. I'm really that curious. When we were children, it was common to believe our homes are haunted and ghosts are for real. For most, a day comes when the night noises of a house fade from paranormal skepticism to just the wind and foundation. However, my house had more to offer me as I grew older and older. As a child, I would be afraid to be in my home alone, even if my parents were simply outside in the yard. The house was really nice, but it was old, and being inside by myself would usually lead to me locking myself in the bathroom or hiding under my blankets while I held down the sheets until my parents came home. The reason I was so afraid of being alone inside was simple. I had a night full of terror early on in grade school, and it left me scarred. When I was in 4th grade, I had my first ever paranormal experience. I had woken up in the middle of the night and was laying on my side. Nothing felt off yet, but for some reason I woke up. We had all tossed and turned in our beds, and that is exactly what I went to do when I locked eyes on the scariest thing I had ever seen. As I rolled over, I looked towards my nightstand to check the time, and it just happened to be within the witching hour of 3 a.m. But that wasn't the scary part, because at the time, I didn't even realize what the hour represented. Instead, I was shocked to see someone, a lady, standing in my doorway, just beyond the short nightstand. Maybe 3 feet away stood this dark woman who appeared so frail and so creepy. I didn't speak. I didn't move. I was paralyzed with fear. Now I know what you're thinking, sleep paralysis. However, I had been awake for a while now and was able to toss and turn in order to see this thing. So there she stood, just staring right into my soul, and the fear was so crippling I can't even put it into words. I stayed awake staring right back for what felt like hours. The ghost, or thing, just stood there in silence the entire night. Eventually, I must have passed out, but soon heard my mother and father wake up, and I immediately started screaming for them. I explained the entire thing, and to my surprise, I was not treated like a scared kid in the movies. My family believed I saw something, and they actually had me sleep in their room, on the floor with their bedroom door shut for many weeks following the incident. Maybe they knew something I didn't, like maybe a deranged family member had been snooping around, Or maybe the creepy neighbors finally had my father concerned. To this day, we speak of this incident, and to this day, they believe something or someone was in our home that night, watching me. The story doesn't stop there. Many friends were at a sleepover of mine about a year later for my birthday. There must have been at least 8 of us that night, when once again something was seen. The dead lady, we'll call it. Something was sitting in our enclosed patio room the night of my birthday party. Everyone saw it. The only distinguishing feature of the figure was the face, the dead woman's face that has eyes that never move. Many friends remember this night and will vouch that what I say really happened. Not a single one of these friends ever stayed the night again. As I got older, I felt way more secure in the house. I was a big guy in high school and played football, so with my big head at that age, I wasn't really scared of anyone, even if I should have been. However, something sinister came back to our home to play with me my senior year. I'm 18 at this point, and know when I'm tripping or if something is real. So one night, as I go to sleep around midnight, I lay on my stomach and shut off my TV. With my legs spread just a bit, I feel something sit between them. You know how the sheets would be pulled tight if something was set between your legs? That's what happened. I wasn't even asleep yet when this happened. It was as if as soon as I turned my back, this thing showed up to scare me. This happened many times, and I complained to my parents about it so much that my father wouldn't let me sleep with my door closed anymore, and he kept the hallway lights on. He did, not me. With tensions high because several nights in a row this had happened, I was happy to finally fall asleep one night with no bedmates. However, I woke up. And I was still on my stomach, uncomfortable, so I tried to sleep again before being disturbed by something. This time, I saw nothing. Instead, something whispered my name right into my ear. Crippled again with fear, I made a fist with my hands and prepared to jump up and fight, but I simply couldn't. After a minute or so, I was able to gain my adrenaline, and I literally went from laying down to standing on my bed with my fists up. I yelled, "Let's go," as if it was time to fight. It was around 4 a.m., and I decided to stay awake until school started. With my home still being troublesome for my sanity, another incident occurs. This is around the same time period, and I'm still in school. I came home with my girlfriend at the time, and for whatever reason, we were in a huge argument. We were sitting in my bed talking it out, when my girlfriend went wide-eyed and pointed to my wall behind me in fear. "A shadow just walked across your wall." She sounded so frightened, and our argument was instantly done. After I told her about the house's history, she told me that she and her family have had many paranormal experiences as well. I always had a feeling that maybe we were arguing because whatever shadow figure was there caused negative energy to manifest. And this would make sense for the earlier years in the house, as well when my parents split up for a short period. There were lots of yelling and arguing, and that's when the most paranormal things happened. Maybe we attracted them, or maybe they latched onto us. The last paranormal experience is the scariest. This one had me about 22 to 23 years old, and home alone on a beautiful sunny afternoon. At this point, I'm 6 foot and 200 pounds, and work at a car shop, so while it may sound cocky, I felt very strong and powerful, especially in my locked home. But this day, something ran my big self out. I was on Xbox in my room and wanted a snack, so I went to make 2 bean burritos with leftovers from the night before. Both of my cats were on the kitchen floor, in front of the fridge as usual, as I made my food. That's when it happened, so fast. As I lay my plate down on the counter, I see and hear it. We have 2 steps leading down into our living room, and the first thing I hear is those steps being stomped on. Then I see an all-black, enormous figure running up the steps and down my hall. I'm in shock. My cats have their ears back and are watching the hall too. I'm shirtless, shoeless, and my cell phone is in my room down the hall. Even the shotgun is down the hall. I was so scared, I knew it was time to bail. I mean, this thing was tall and big and all shadowy. If you ever read paranormal stuff, the black figures are usually demonic or bad, and with my experience, I was scared. A big grown man scared as a cat. I play it off like I saw nothing. I was so scared that I literally act like I'm unfazed and say, these burritos are gonna be great. Then I ran for my back door so fast, I hit my garage door opener and held the doorknob shut as tight as I could until the garage opened and I ran outside to my driveway. What was I supposed to do now? If I go to my neighbors shirtless with a scary tale, I'll be the neighborhood loony. So I waited. Finally, my father showed up from work, and I explained the story to him. I even said, to be honest, it could be an actual break-in, so we went in big and bad, and as usual, nothing was found. We checked everything from the attic to the fireplace flue for intrusions, which meant either I was crazy or another paranormal phenomenon took place. This one was different. I mean, I saw this thing, watched it move fast, and heard it. The cats were even fazed a little by this. The thing that gets really scary is my mother soon after, and I mean like 2 weeks after, is home alone while my father and I go to watch some dirt track racing. She texts us and asks if we're coming home yet, and we say yes, and then she sent the text to our group chat saying she's scared. I call her while my father drives, and she explains that she's safe and hanging out in the garage, which was normal. However, she says she saw what I saw. I am so shocked at this point. She described it as big, and all black with an all black cloak hanging off its back. Now I don't know about you, but this thing doesn't sound like no Superman. My father now denies the happenings in the home, and I have luckily moved out and have been safe from such experiences since. My mother tells me often of things she hears when home alone, and that she has heard doors slam when inside all alone. The last tale of the house includes my mother, but not really. I was on Xbox and I heard a door slam. It was late and I figured she was home from work. I heard the door, then I hear the usual bags being placed down on the table. Then I heard the footsteps of my mother and her exact voice yell out, "Hey, I'm home." So I shouted back, "Okay." I had friends on Xbox Live at the time, and even they heard the conversation. So about an hour went by when I go out of my room to see what's going on that night, when I find that my mother has left. I say that because her bags aren't on the table, and I'm home alone with all the lights off. I call my mum. I ask her where she had to go. Her response left me cold. I'm just now coming home from work. I've been a bartender for about 8 years. I don't want to say where because it's actually quite famous to the whole world, but nobody really knows that it's haunted, except for the employees and previous employees. Most of us have an experience or two, although we do have 1 or 2 employees that have worked there for decades and said they've never experienced anything, but more employees have had experiences than haven't. I've been tapped on the shoulder, tugged on the shirt, and felt hands on my back when no one is around and I'm alone in my space. Other employees mentioned experiencing these things as well. Some have seen ghosts there. I honestly couldn't guess how many ghosts we have. A few maybe. The building is 3 floors, and the 3rd floor is definitely the scariest. Most employees will attest to that. In fact, we have a bartender in his 60s who has to clean up the 3rd floor at the end of the night, and he hates it so bad. He's had so many things happen to him up there, but he speaks mostly Spanish, and my Spanish is very amateur at best, so he's only conveyed a few stories to me. He also doesn't like to talk about it. He points at his arm, then rubs it, insinuating goosebumps, and shakes his head no. My boss saw an old man in a mirror upstairs on that same floor. She was washing her hands in the bathroom with the door open. When she looked up in the mirror, she could see the hallway reflected in it behind her, and she said an old man peeked out of one of the doorways and looked at her. She hauled ass downstairs and sent security up to look around, but nobody was there. Apparently, before I worked there, they had a security guard who was a really big dude, really intimidating energy. One night, he was supposed to be watching the 2nd floor while waiting to close up, and he was up there by himself. I guess he came down to my boss in tears, saying that he could never work on any floor except the 1st floor again, otherwise he would have to quit. I mostly work on the 1st floor, and that's where most of my incidents have happened. The most notable one was catching in my peripherals a very short person in a white shirt walking super fast past my bar and into our kitchen. The movement struck me as strange compared to how our other bar staff moved, so I stepped out of the bar and checked the kitchen. Nobody was there. My main barback, I'll call him Carlos, told me about the ghost before I ever experienced it, so we've talked about the ghost a lot. Fantasma, we say, Spanish for ghost. After I saw this figure go into the kitchen and found the kitchen empty, I went over to Carlos, who was sweeping part of the dance floor. All I said to him was, "I think I just saw the Fantasma." And he replies, "White t-shirt, this tall?" gesturing a very short height with his hand. It immediately gave me goosebumps. "Yes," I said. He replied with something like, "Yeah, I saw him walk into the kitchen earlier." I went back there to tell him he couldn't be there, but nobody was there. The barbacks claim to experience a lot in the kitchen. Really, there's experiences all over the damn building. If I told all the stories I heard, this would never end. This is a story from my parents and 2 incredibly close family friends. Before I was born, the 4 of them used to hang out a lot. They would often drive far out into the Mojave Desert, just to party and drink around a fire and have a good time. Anyway, for this story I'm gonna call my dad Comrade and mum Stacy, and their friends I'll call Brad and Gina. So they drive way out into the desert to have a fire. It's summertime, it's hot, although it is in the middle of the night, but it's still definitely not cold. Well, my mum Stacy and her friend Gina were starting to get scared about tarantulas and decided they didn't want to camp out there after all. So all 4 of them started driving back. It's like 2 a.m. They were on a dirt road that went on for miles and miles with nothing on it. Suddenly, up ahead in the headlights, they saw a man in a long black trench coat with a wide-brimmed hat and the collar of his coat pulled up, walking along the side of the road, going the same direction they were driving. My dad grew up hitchhiking a lot and used to pick up hitchhikers as well, so my mum knew my dad would consider stopping and talking to this guy to see if he needed a ride. But they got a terrible feeling about him. My mum always said that the way he was walking, the way he looked and was dressed, and how he was out in the middle of nowhere, he was just emitting this really messed up energy that felt absolutely terrifying and even evil. Gina felt the same way. My dad starts joking, "Hey, let's pick this guy up." And my mum and Gina immediately start screaming and crying and begging him not to. They were in the back seat, my dad was driving, and Brad in the passenger seat. Gina was even punching my dad in the back, screaming, "No, don't stop." I guess my dad slowed way down as he passed him, and they all turned to look at him as they went by. However, the moment they passed him, he was gone. It was as if he disappeared into thin air. It's not like there were rocks or trees to hide behind. And the weird thing is, I grew up hearing this story from my parents, but living far away from their friends. When I was very young, we moved up north and they lost touch. Although whenever we'd come back to California to visit, we'd always get together with them, and it was like nothing had changed. I moved back here to California as an adult, and I work for Gina now. One of our first conversations when I came back was about the Hat Man. She brought it up to me, and she said word for word the exact same story my parents always told me growing up. To be honest, I've always secretly feared, yet been intrigued by this entity because of their story, and then so many more that I have now read online. I couldn't believe it was such a big phenomenon when I first found it on the internet, because I was growing up hearing my parents' story long before the internet existed. I have been living in the same house with my father for most of my life. When I was young, I had scary things I saw in my bedroom at night. Mainly a cloaked man who resembled death would float out of the wall on one side of my room and go through the opposite side. It would be a nightly occurrence to the point where I knew it would happen, and I would hide under my covers, sweating while knowing what was happening around me. It used to be a joke that I slept in a cocoon. I wouldn't just experience things like this at my house, it would be at others as well. Once I was about 8 or 9 and had a sleepover at my cousin's place. I remember waking up in the middle of the night, covers wrapped over my head, so just my eyes and nose were visible. I noticed a pair of legs standing in front of my face. I felt immediate terror and couldn't bear to look up. I just pretended to be asleep and never spoke of it again. At my grandparents' house, I'd sleep over, again about 9 years old, and would constantly have experiences of hearing footsteps coming to my door and then continuing down past my room. My door would be open so I could see no one was there. I one time woke up and was face to face with a dog, but quickly wrapped the sheets back over my face and prayed it would go away. Anyway, all these experiences and more I had put off to being young, tired, and just made up in my head because ghosts aren't real, until last night, which confirms all my experiences. Well, the other night, I was sitting in my room reading with my dog on my bed, as I usually do. It was about 12:30 a.m. I then heard a light thud on my door, and when I had looked up, my shower towel that hangs on the back of my door started swaying slightly. It then stopped for a second or two and began swaying a bit more aggressively. At this point, fear and terror took over, and I yelled out, "Spirit, you're not welcome here." At that point I had said this, the towel was thrown off of the hook on the back of my door, scaring both me and my dog. Since this happened, it's validated that the spirit is real, and I've been trying to find answers, but I don't really know where to look. Everyone I've spoke to doesn't seem to believe me or has some other far-fetched explanation. This whole thing sounds like a joke and stupid, but I have no explanation as to why or how this happened. I should also add that there is no vent near my towel. Windows are closed as it's winter and very cold. My door was closed, so nothing external from the room could have affected it. I just feel alone and terrified every night. So this is a short, cheeky situation that happened to my friends and me in the middle of the summer in Denver around about 2008. We were bored and sitting around telling stories about the random things that we have done in life. And my time working as a locator for a paranormal hunting group came up. Basically, it was the one who looked for potential haunts, and I would contact the owner of whatever property they were going to hunt, and I would arrange the whole thing permission-wise. The group had a lawyer and insurance that handled the waivers and such. I just got them all in touch with each other to make sure everything was above board and legal, and that the owner wasn't held liable if one of my idiot hunters went screaming into a hole in the property in the middle of the night. Well, that interested a friend, who at the time was a skeptic of the paranormal. One of my roommates mentioned our basement was haunted. A recurring theme in my life, I know. The skeptic said we should do an investigation, which translated into there being 6 of us in the basement, sitting in a semicircle with some equipment, asking questions. Most of the people don't matter, save Rob, my best friend, and Goldie, our skeptic friend. Goldie didn't believe in the paranormal and was adamant that all those people are con artists. I guess that included me too, but no worries, I don't take things personally. The basement was an unfinished large room with a metal pole in the middle. We were sitting in front of that pole, and I pulled out a couple of things I still had left over from when the paranormal hunting group broke up. I keep saying hunting and not investigating because these guys were idiots. They didn't try to debunk or gather evidence so much as they ran around the property acting like assholes. I won't mention their names now, or the group name, because I'm not a petty person. The equipment that was most important to this situation was the thermometer and the recorder. When we started, I gave Goldie the thermometer, and Rob was recorder guy. Rob had done investigations with me a couple of times in the past, just the 2 of us, and he knew to call out shuffling or whispered conversation to mark it on the audio. He was also my sound guy in general. Anytime I got audio evidence, he was the one that found it for me, so the call-outs were to help him sort the sounds of playbacks. So we sat, and Goldie commented how warm the basement was. It was a hot day, and there was no AC venting into the basement. The thermometer said it was in the low 80s, so we sat there for a while, asking questions and goofing around in the dark. No one was taking this seriously. After some time, I realized half my body was very cold. Goldie commented almost immediately after that it felt freezing in the room now. She shined a light on the thermometer, and it was down to 44 degrees Fahrenheit. We were staring at the readout silently when Bob suddenly yelped and jumped up, then took off upstairs. We followed after into the warm upper level, and Rob was pacing around, all hyper and freaked out. This guy was a rock, and here he was, babbling like a scared child. Once I calmed him down, he told me what had happened. As we were looking at the temperature, he heard a whisper in his ear and felt a shocking cold sensation on his crotch. Not one to be interested in that kind of experience with the dead, he freaked out and took off. We didn't have any evidence except his recounting of that uncomfortable situation until we reviewed the audio. There, right between me commenting about how the temperature had dropped 40 degrees, and Rob jumping out of his seat, a clear female voice can be heard saying, "I'm so alone." Goldie freaked out. She was the only woman in the room at the time, and this voice was right next to the mic, while she was at least 8 feet away next to me. These days, Goldie is much more open to the idea of ghosts and spirits. And that's the story of the lonely ghost, or the time Rob got groped by the undead. Not a fully direct experience, but one from my brother from I think about 2013 that we always bring up. We are both originally from the pretty far northwest Highlands of Scotland, and we were both living there one winter, working the same job. Salmon farming, if you're curious. It gets really dark, really cold, and really stormy in the winter, and we're from a very small village next to the sea, maybe 50 houses spread out along a few miles. Just darkness, heather moors, sea and mountains on either side outside the little row of streetlights. I was living with my mum in her little stone house, which was cozy enough and nothing untoward happened, but my brother was renting a massive house about half a mile up the road. It was about 6 bedrooms, I think, very old and tucked away in some trees at the bend in the road. Most of the rooms were unused and full of old junk, which was spooky enough. My brother just used his living room, bedroom, and we had converted a downstairs room into a gym that we used together. Apparently, he was sitting watching TV one night alone on a fairly still night. His living room had a direct door to the outside, which was seized shut, and the door handle started to rattle. Not the whole door shaking with the wind or whatever, just the door handle, as if someone was outside ragging on the door trying to open it. Even more unsettling is that there were big windows on the house, and you could effectively see the outside from this door. Obviously, no one was there. After a while, it stopped, but I think he had a very restless night. He's not really into this kind of thing, so I'm inclined to believe him. He seemed rattled the next day. What's more, I may have imagined it, but when I was working out in our rudimentary gym alone, I had a key. I could swear I heard footsteps, or the sound of someone pushing a heavy thing across the floor upstairs. Most likely just the wind, but it did creep me out a little, even in broad daylight. On top of that, the closest building to his house is actually an 18th or 19th century ruin, just on the other side of the trees. There are a lot of these there. It is set back from the road, an upslope, so on a dark night the streetlights don't catch it, and its silhouette's quite spooky. This photo is from a walk last week actually, when I was visiting my mum. Me and my brother live in cities now. So anyway, everyone I know agrees that this ruin is different from the others in the village somehow. There really are loads of them left over from the Highland clearances, a particularly dark time in the Scottish Highlands. I have always felt the need to speed up when I walk past it, and my wife even said the same thing last week when we went for a stroll. There is something weird about it. When I was living there and had to walk my mum's dog, he used to get his hackles up and growl in its direction most nights. All the other ruins feel quite benign and empty. You don't really notice them, and they are pretty close to the modern road, so are well lit by the street lamps. Most probably, a deer or something liked to frequent it, which annoyed the old dog, and the way it looks is quite stark and does set the imagination going. But I can't help thinking that there's some kind of mournful, vengeful presence there that terrorizes everyone living nearby on a cold Highland winter night. My father and his ex-wife had purchased land to build a house on the outskirts of my town that was predominantly a farming community. There were 8 kids, plus the parents and my uncle and his 2 kids living in the home during the time of the haunting. My younger sister, we'll call her Rena, who was about 13 at the time and was budding into a hardcore punk goddess. She and her friends had become obsessed with seances and were doing them regularly at each other's respective houses for fun during sleepovers. One night, Rena encouraged 5 of the siblings, including one of my cousins, to perform a seance in the basement of our newly built home with her. Myself and the youngest 2 of the kids were not present. From what I've been told, Rena was trying to contact River Phoenix. She was obsessed with the film Stand By Me at the time, and was getting frustrated with the lack of response in front of the other kids. Rena explained something to the effect of, well, since the spirits are going to be pussies, we're going to end it, and blew out the candle they had set up in the middle of their hand-holding circle. Most of the siblings present for the seance recall an eerie, almost pressure descend onto the room when the candle went out. But that was about it. Even though I wasn't present for the seance, that's when the sightings began for me. I believe it was a week or so later when I woke up in the middle of the night. For context, the kids were two to a room. Rena and I slept in the framed-out basement with blankets for walls, so we could hear everything in the basement from our room. All the other kids had fully finished rooms upstairs where the two cousins also slept. My uncle slept in the other blanket room adjacent to ours. When I woke up that night, a shadow-like figure darted in front of me and crouched down about 3 feet away from me and just stared. In my half-awake state, I said, "Rena, what are you doing?" Because I thought the figure was my sister who had gotten up in the middle of the night and was trying to pull some odd prank on me. The figure said nothing, but reacted to my voice by tilting its head to one side, still staring at me. I couldn't actually make out any features, but the moonlight from the window well cast enough light to fully outline the character, who was obviously facing my direction. More awake now, I said louder, "Rena, what are you doing?" The figure tilted its head again, the opposite way, and then vanished in a mist-like fashion. At that point, I thought I was just exhausted, and that what I had seen was just a dream, and turned over to go back to sleep. The second time I saw the ghost was another couple of weeks later. By this time, typical things of hauntings had started occurring in the home. Lights going on and off, doors opening and shutting, the TV turning on to white noise in the middle of the night. But the whole family hadn't caught on to something happening, and each encounter was caught by someone else, so all 13 of us thought nothing of each small instance, as it was not equaling a whole quite yet. For me though, the second night I randomly woke up, I was sleeping on my back. I awoke suddenly to a shadow figure leaning over me, as if they were straddling me, but there was no pressure on my bed to indicate anyone was actually there. It was like the figure was floating above me. The figure abruptly brought their hands above their head and moved as if to strike down on me with a hammer punch with both fists. I swiftly moved my arms up above my head to block the blow, but by the time my arms reached overhead, the figure was gone. It was as if my arms had wiped it away as they moved past my face. I lay there stunned for a moment, but ultimately decided that it was another dream and fell back asleep. Another couple of weeks passed when the ghost woke me up again. I shot straight up in bed from a side sleeping position and turned immediately to the window well. The figure was leaning into the well from up above and was just looking at me. I stared back for what felt like a few minutes, but had to have been less than 20 seconds, while the figure did that familiar head tilt back and forth as it examined me. It misted away in the same fashion as the first encounter, and I just fell back into bed, asleep. This was the only time I had seen the outline of the hat that would become important to other family members' experiences. So up to this point, I hadn't told anyone of what was going on. I thought I was dreaming each time these occurred and didn't think much of the sightings. But a few days after this last encounter, my dad expressed some discomfort with the other kids. He stated that a few of them were seeing things in the house and that they were afraid of the basement because that's where the Dark Man lived. I don't know why, but I was supremely unconcerned with what was going on, and just nonchalantly stated, "Oh yeah, I've seen him." My dad gave me a shocked look and asked when. I recounted my previous sighting to him and expressed that I had only thought they were dreams at the time, and his shock only increased. For further context, my father believes in ghosts, as do much of my family, including myself. We all love watching those shows about ghost hunting and are regular visitors to some of the haunted areas in our town. But my father expressed that he didn't believe a word of the other kids since they were much younger and could be influenced. But since the oldest, maybe around 14 or 15, had seen it and hadn't said anything, he felt very compelled to believe everyone now. Once the whole family had agreed something was going on in the house, it's like the entity took the haunting up a notch. They started getting pretty aggressive, especially to the youngest siblings. Once the family all realized something was going on, the hauntings got more regular and ultimately more aggressive. I believe all of this had to do with the attention we were all giving the experiences now. In fact, all the kids started messing with the ghost, and my sister Rena led a couple more seances to try and figure out who the entity was. I guess during one of the seances, one of my little brothers felt someone blow on his ear. The same time the candle blew out on its own. Everyone screamed and ran upstairs. The siblings even came up with a game called the Dark Man, and would take turns sitting in the blanket room that was my uncle's in the basement and goad the entity with taunts of saying, "Dark Man." One of my youngest brothers was sitting in there when he saw a figure materialize in the hallway. The figure was a shadow and had what looked like a wide brim hat on. The figure slowly started walking the length of the hallway to the blanket draped over the doorway. He said he started screaming and the other kids came rushing down the stairs and the figure vanished before the doorway as they came round the corner. I myself would sometimes wake up in the middle of the night and would listen to sounds of footprints walking up and down the basement stairs without fear. At this point, we were all individually startled, but as a group, not very scared. We all believed in spirits, and honestly, at the time, it was kind of cool when the basement door would open and shut on its own while we were watching TV in the living room. We would stop and stare at each other excitedly to see if something else would happen. But then, an entity started messing with the younger siblings. We never really spoke of the Dark Man to the youngest to prevent them from being scared, but evidently they were seeing the Dark Man anyway. The two youngest were 1.5 and 6. We'll call them May and Carrie. May and Carrie shared one of the finished rooms upstairs. Carrie, 6, was terrified of the Dark Man. Apparently, she had seen him multiple times in her closet, just staring at her. She would always scream and cry and end up sleeping with the parents because of her fear. She was the only one of us who could describe at length what the entity looked like. One night, Carrie was just fixated on her closet. She said she knew the Dark Man was in there, and she was waiting for him to peek out at her. She stared in horror as the Dark Man looked out at her, but wasn't a shadow. She described him as a dirty white farmer with overalls and a wicker hat that leaned out of the closet, looked at her, left the closet, and walked into the hallway, walked back from the hallway staring at her as he re-entered the closet and vanished. My dad's ex-wife later described this as a shriek of absolute terror as she ran to confront Carrie. After Carrie's incident, my dad's ex-wife became increasingly on edge about what was going on in the house, especially the long-term effects it would have on the two youngest, but my dad was too enthralled about the haunting and told her not to worry about it. She explained to him that she'd woken up to the TV in their room being on to white noise and the figure standing above her. She said she felt it wasn't a good presence and that we needed to get out. My dad, up to this point, hadn't had too many first-hand experiences. He shared the same incident with the TV being on to white noise when the remote was across the room, but didn't think it warranted an intervention, but merely to just ignore the goings-on. Then the entity really started in on May. During all the time, the rest of the kids were joking and messing with the ghost, and Carrie being terrified of it, May was starting to see odd things and wake up screaming in the night. May was only 1.5 years old and didn't have enough vocabulary to say much. She knew the word doggy really well, as it was her first word. She would point and exclaim, "Doggy," at pretty much anything. One night, Rena and her friend were babysitting, having a sleepover at the house. I don't remember why, but me and a few other siblings, including Carrie and the parents, were not home for this one. When they heard May let out a blood-curdling scream, they ran upstairs. She was standing in her crib, facing the corner of the room, repeatedly screaming, "Doggy, doggy." Every time, May looked over her shoulder at the closet, the same closet as Carrie's, and she would whip her head away, resuming the shriek, "Doggy." May was inconsolable in their room, so Rena and her friend brought her downstairs to sleep on the couch while they resumed watching TV, absolutely shook up themselves. A few days later, I heard May upstairs screaming "Doggy," but I knew my dad was up there and that he was taking care of it. And then my dad started to yell for me to get May's blanket and Nuck to him. I located the items and tried to offer it to May when I arrived to the room. She wouldn't take them, but kept looking behind my father and pointing to the corner of the room, shouting "Doggy." Both my dad and I looked behind us, to nothing there, but May incessantly pointed to the empty corner, screaming "Doggy." We had to remove her from the room in order to calm her down. The last incident with May finally tipped my dad to figure out a way to get rid of the entity. My dad did some research into how to exorcise a ghost, as he was now scared for how the ghost was beginning to terrorize the family, especially the youngest too. He looked up some methods that day after May's encounter and settled on one he felt comfortable with. When he went to bed that night, my father woke up to the dark man standing above him, and he shot out of bed with a gasp. This awoke my dad's ex, and she said, "You finally saw him, didn't you?" He said yes, and they made a plan for her to take everyone from the house so he could get rid of the ghost alone. When we all left the next day for some family outing without Dad, he began his ritual. He later explained to me how he went into every room and dictated loudly and firmly that the presence was not allowed in the threshold and that it needed to leave the house, that it was no longer welcome. He did this in every room multiple times, and even the garage and outer perimeter of the home. After the family outing, I saw no more of the dark man, or heard his footsteps, or had odd experiences throughout the home. May and Carrie no longer wake up screaming, and everything seems to be back to normal. At first, I didn't realize it, but I was so used to the happenings, and the kids were still going through the motions of messing with the ghost. It took a few weeks to realize I hadn't had anything odd happen. In fact, it took my father bringing it to my attention that nothing odd happened for me to realize it stopped. See, my dad hadn't told any of us what he did that day. He waited a few weeks to make sure it worked before expressing to us that he had rid us of the ghost. A few of my siblings maintained that the dark man was still there, and they continued to play the dark man game for some time after, but we eventually accepted he was gone. All of us love to share these stories to this day, and the only one who arguably had the most traumatizing experience can't remember any of it because she was so young. But May loves to hear them, so we recount our sides, including what happened to her.